Now, if Jesus was a ghost, he's not solid, right? The food would just fall down, fall through the image of his body and hit the ground, plop, there's a piece of fish. But he eats it and the fish is gone. He's eaten it. So clear demonstration that Jesus is here literally in the flesh. He is alive. He has been raised from the dead. Hi again, welcome to our final video in our Advent series about Advent encounters with Jesus. This is the fourth of 4 videos, and this time we'll be looking at his encounters post-resurrection, resurrection morning and that day, in the weeks that followed, in his post-resurrection appearances and beyond. When we picture Jesus and his disciples, usually the first image that pops to mind is Jesus with these 12 men wandering around in towns and countrysides, picking grain from the fields and crossing the lake in boats, and Jesus teaching these 12 men. But in fact, Jesus had many disciples who came in and out of the story as we went along, both men and women. One of the most prominent groups of disciples, other than the 12, is this group of women that Luke refers to earlier on in the gospel, who were all socially prominent, well off financially, who traveled with Jesus back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem. They were disciples who followed him, and they're the ones who supported the ministry. They bankrolled it. That's what Luke tells us. They were the ones who provided for them out of their own means. And this would have been contrary to beliefs of the time, this idea that these women were the ones who were supporting financially, and yet Jesus had no problem with that and welcomed them and treated them with respect. Now, most prominent among them was Mary Magdalene. And Luke mentions a couple more by name. He mentions Joanna, who's a wife of a man named Chuza, who was a prominent member of the royal court of Herod. Another woman named Susanna, about whom Luke doesn't say anything else, but this was a significant person among Jesus' followers. And he says, and many other women, right? So it's not just these 3, there's a group of them. They appear most prominently at his crucifixion. When we have that picture of the cross, his disciples basically scattered. They fled. They were in fear of the authorities. They abandoned Jesus, except for John, who was there at the cross. But along with John, there was a bunch of women there. Mary, also his mother, but also these women who had followed him back and forth. They stayed with the Lord during his suffering, during his death. They accompanied Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and witnessed the burial of Jesus, where he was laid and how he was laid. They came back on Sunday morning with more spices and herbs and those things that they had, ointments, to properly bury Jesus, to finish off the burial process. And of course, what happens? They're met by 2 angels, where the stone's been rolled away, an angel sitting on it. They're told, he's not here, he's risen. Go and tell his disciples, meaning the apostles, the 12. These women who were respected and welcomed by Jesus and had been commissioned by him to go and tell his disciples about his resurrection. And yet when they come to the disciples and tell them that angels have told us that the Lord is risen, they considered what the women were saying to be foolishness or babbling and did not believe them. Jesus chose them to be the first to spread the news, but his own disciples didn't believe them. Going from this group of prominent women that were supporting Jesus, we want to focus specifically on Mary Magdalene, who is always mentioned first in the group. In fact, she is mentioned more times in the Gospels than any of the 12 apostles except for Peter. She was quite prominent and quite significant among Jesus' disciples during his time on earth. Lots of stories and legends and things that have grown up over the centuries around Mary Magdalene in popular culture and in the church simply aren't true. Only things that we know for certain from the Gospels about Mary's personal life and her background are the fact that she was from a town called Magdala, which is on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, hence her name. And we also know what the Gospels tell us, that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdala, was probably a widow who had wealth, so she had means and opportunity to travel independently and support Jesus from her finances. So together with these other women, she was there at the crucifixion, at the burial of Jesus. But Mary had a further and much deeper experience in this resurrection account. Mary apparently stayed behind or was there still at the tomb. It says she was crying. And then Jesus appears to her. She doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener, and she says, where have you put him? Just give him to me, please, and I'll take care of him. And Jesus just stops her in her tracks with just a word, with her name. Again, the level of honor and friendship and intimacy that they had, all he had to do was say, Mary. It's me. It's just a beautiful picture. And she's like, Rabboni, my teacher. Mary was the first person to see Jesus alive after his resurrection. Of all the people Jesus could have chosen, he chose Mary to see the risen Lord. This is huge because In that culture, again, women's testimony, women's intelligence, women's trustworthiness, all of that was deeply disrespected, not only by the Greco-Roman culture, but by the Jewish culture. He basically tells Mary, go and tell Peter and the rest of them that I've seen the Lord. As later writers throughout church history have noted, this essentially makes Mary an apostle to the apostles, because the apostles' task was to witness to Jesus' resurrection. And the first person who witnessed Jesus' resurrection was Mary Magdalene, and she told the apostles. They got it secondhand from her. Mary Magdalene may have been the first to see the risen Lord, but of course she wasn't the last. And outside of even the other 11, there were other people, select witnesses, whom specifically chosen by the Lord to appear to witness him. The Gospel of Luke focuses on these two men, two disciples, who are walking away from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus. They're discussing among themselves the events, everything. Now, these aren't members of the 11. These aren't like the core group of these are just two other disciples. One of them is named Cleopas, and the other one we don't even get a name for. They're walking and discussing. Jesus sort of pulls up beside them. He just shows up, and there he is walking with them. So what's up? What are you talking about? And their response is, are you the only person here who doesn't know what's been going on? And Jesus goes, what things? Like, oh, do tell. This opens the floodgates. They just start telling them. The way it's recorded, it sounds like they just ran it like in one sentence without a breath, oh, about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a great prophet and highly regarded, and he did wonders and miracles and healed people, and he was teaching. It's like, we thought, everyone's waiting for the Messiah and this is it. But then he was betrayed and arrested, and the Jews had him arrested, and the Romans put him to death, and we thought he was the one, and now he's buried. And they get all that out in a rush. As they walked, Jesus opened their eyes to the scriptures and started explaining to them everything in the scriptures. That would be the Old Testament, that we would call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, about all the things that pertain to himself. And so, it's a long walk. They got some time. And when they get to Emmaus, Jesus made like he was going to keep walking. Join us for food, stay with us for the night. And Jesus says, okay, goes in with them. Jesus breaks bread and gives thanks. And in that moment, their eyes are opened, and it's Jesus. The minute they recognize him, he disappears from among them. In that moment, Jesus is gone. They're basically like, weren't our hearts burning within us as he explained the scriptures to us? And they recognize that it's the Lord. And back they go to Jerusalem to go see the 11 who are gathered together to tell them that they've met Jesus on the road. These men had started this walk out earlier in the day to this town full of despondency, discouragement. Within this little journey there and back, all of that despondency, all of that discouragement has been turned to joy. Now, in the evening of the Sunday that Jesus rose from the dead, 10 of the apostles were huddled in the upper room for fear of the authorities. The doors were locked, and it's understandable. The Jewish authorities had just convinced the Roman authorities to put their Lord to death. They were his disciples, so they were locked up for fear of reprisal that was going to come. Despite these added security measures of a locked door, Jesus showed up in the midst of them and said, "Peace be with you." But Thomas wasn't present. We don't know why. We're not told specifics, but he wasn't there. The 10 started telling Thomas in the days that followed about the fact that the Lord had come and been among them, had come into the room, even though the doors were locked, and that they'd seen the risen Lord. But Thomas was rather strident in his unbelief. He actually told them, he says, unless I can put my fingers in the nail marks in his hand and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And people have kind of, I think, given Thomas a bit of a rough time about this. He's gone down as doubting Thomas, that sort of thing. But the scripture doesn't call him that. If any of us have experienced having hopes and dreams that have been dashed, perhaps we have someone we know who's suffered like that, and they feel burned. They feel in the sense that they're just emotionally burned out. And now he's being told, though he didn't see it, that Jesus is alive. You can see him checking out emotionally and mentally and saying, look, unless I can physically touch him, touch the wounds, I'm out. And yet Jesus shows up 1 week later, same scene, upper room, they're all in there. The doors are locked again. Thomas is with them this time, and Jesus appears again in the midst, but this time his first order of business is Thomas. It's restoring Thomas's faith. It's notable that Jesus nowhere rebukes Thomas. He doesn't speak harshly to him. He simply goes up to Thomas and says to him, here, put your fingers in the nail marks, put your hand in my side. Such a gracious, intimate invite to touch me, feel me, see my side, see my hand, see that it's me, see that I'm solid. And then he says to him, don't be faithless, but believe. Trust that I have got this, I have got you, and I am who I say I am. To which Thomas responds with, my Lord and my God. It's interesting about this entire exchange, this entire encounter between Thomas and Jesus. Not only does Jesus not rebuke Thomas, but also provides the evidence that he needs to believe. There's this misconception, I think, in the world at large, and sometimes even among believers, that faith is contrary to evidence. Faith is just leaping into the dark when you don't know. And it's completely the opposite. Genuine faith is always built on evidence. God reveals himself throughout his word. He reveals his character, his nature, his actions, his miracles. That's what Jesus does here. He does not rebuke Thomas, but gives him the evidence he needs. Thomas' response to all of this is calling Jesus God, saying, my Lord and my God. It's one of the clearest, most unequivocal statements of Jesus' deity. Here's Thomas declaring the divinity of his Lord. Now, Thomas wasn't the only one of the apostles who doubted and whom Jesus had to graciously convince them that he was alive. It was true of all of them, and we're going to backtrack a week to that first encounter in the upper room, the night of Jesus' resurrection. They're all gathered together, huddled in this room behind locked doors for fear of the authorities. When Thomas isn't there, the other 10 are, and Jesus appears to them, comes through behind locked doors. He says to them, peace. They were afraid. They were terrified, and it says they thought he was a ghost. The superstitions kick in, and what are we seeing? This is a phantom. This is a ghost. Jesus quickly disabuses them of that idea. You see me that I have flesh and bone, that I'm physically here. See the wounds in my hands and in my feet, that where the nails went in, the marks that are still there. And yeah, he shows them everything that they need to see, that he is literally physically here. He is not a ghost. The icing on the cake, I guess, or the cherry on the cake, Jesus asks for some food. He says, you have any food here? And they say, we got a piece of fish. They give him the fish. Jesus eats it in front of them. Now, if Jesus was a ghost, he's not solid, right? The food would just fall through the image of his body and hit the ground, plop, there's a piece of fish. But he eats it and the fish is gone. He's eaten it. So clear demonstration that Jesus is literally in the flesh. He is alive. He has been raised from the dead. Now, of course, this is important because our faith, the Christian faith, rests on the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus really, truly rose from the dead. Therefore, everything he said about himself was true. God had accepted his sacrifice. He had purchased salvation. There was hope for us beyond the grave. He was truly the resurrection and the life. If he had been the ghost, that wouldn't be true. Then he spent 40 more days with them, during which he appeared to them in a number of times in different locations, in different groupings, individuals, a subgroup of them, of the 11, and all of the 11, and on another occasion, 500 followers. All of these appearances, which Luke calls many incontrovertible proofs, Jesus kept appearing with them, and then after 40 days, he led them out to the vicinity of Bethany, where they'd spent so much time with their friends, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And from there, he was taken from them, and he rose through the clouds and ascended back to his Father and promised them that he would be back at the end of time, and left them to be his witnesses of his death, his resurrection. They were to spread the gospel to the world. And through these 3 years, the encounter of these 11 men who had been with Jesus, lived with him, walked with him, ate with him, struggled with him, rejoiced with him, they had been changed. This very diverse group that Jesus had hand-selected, even the one that betrayed him, which was Judas, these 4 fishermen, a tax collector, Simon the Zealot, who was basically an insurrectionist, a guy fighting the Roman government. So these are the kinds of people that Jesus collected in this group. Matthew and Simon the Zealot would have been natural enemies, but here they were brought together. They were changed men. They became Jesus' instrument to spread the gospel to the world. And despite the fact that they would face persecution, imprisonment, and even death, they were the ones who took the word of Jesus, the good news, to Judea, to Samaria, to the rest of the world. Now, even after Jesus returned to his Father in heaven, he still had one more witness, one more apostle to call, and that was Saul of Tarsus, who was later to be known as Paul, the apostle. From any human standpoint, this is not a person you would think would ever even become a believer in Jesus, never mind an apostle. He was a well-educated Pharisee, a young Pharisee who was a rising star in Judaism, in the central authority of the teachers and the people in Jerusalem, the Jewish authorities. He's got letters of permission and of commission from the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem to go out and essentially hunt down Christians, imprison them, and at the worst, they would persuade the Roman authorities that they're subversive, just like Jesus was, and have them put to death. So this is what what Paul was doing when he was still Saul, or went by Saul. So he was a vehement enemy of Christianity. Paul later points out that he is the chief of sinners and that he got mercy. So if he could be saved, grace is available for anyone. Saul's story, he's on the road to Damascus. Jesus appears to him and says to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Which demonstrates how close Jesus considers those who are his. Persecuting them is persecuting him. So that's what Jesus says to him. And Paul says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I'm Jesus who you're persecuting." Paul is struck blind for a time, and he's given instructions to go to Damascus, where he will be met, he will be prayed for, he will be baptized, and will be given his commission to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And he will receive his sight back, of course. Now, Saul's background, his theological training as an educated young Pharisee, the fact that he was a Roman citizen, his familiarity with Greek culture, Greek language, Greek writings and philosophy, all of that fitted him eminently for the task that God had for him, to be the spearhead of the gospel past the world of the Jews to the wider Gentile world. He changed his name from Saul to Paul, which is their equivalent names. Saul is the Hebrew form of his name. Paul is the Greek form of the same name. He was an apostle to the Gentiles, though he was still a Jew. By being the apostle to the Gentiles, he is the apostle to us, because we're Gentiles. The vast majority of Christians nowadays do not come from a Jewish background. We're from the nations of the earth, from every tribe, kindred, and tongue and language. That all started with Paul. That was Jesus' plan all along when he said, "You will be witnesses to me all the way out to the ends of the earth." And of course, it is through Paul that we have the bulk of the New Testament scriptures, other than the 4 Gospels. And that wraps up our look at Jesus' various encounters throughout the Gospels for Advent. Each of these encounters said something different about him, revealed something different about his person and his work, and tells us something about ourselves, about how we can find hope, grace, and joy continually throughout our lives through Jesus. We started at the beginning with his life in eternity past with his Father, and we ended with his commissioning of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, and then everything in between in the Gospels. And if you want to pursue these devotions further with your family, to study them day by day through Advent, I invite you to check out our devotional, this 24-day devotional called An Advent Encounter. You can download it as a free PDF on our website. Thanks very much. Have a blessed Advent and a blessed Christmas and New Year.
Discover how Jesus' disciples, skeptics, and enemies changed forever, and how Advent can change us too.